Hello and welcome to Suzi's Book Bag, hosted by me, Suzi Fay. I'm not quite sure where I picked up this particular book bag, but it says, just right, tell your story. And the person I'm going to talk to for the next hour or so did decide to tell her story. I want to know what brought that on and why now and all those good things. So without further ado, let me welcome into the book bag. I can hear she's out there somewhere. Catherine Taylor, welcome into the book bag.
Hi, Suzi.
How are you doing?
Thank you. I'm good, thanks.
Now, we're going to be talking about your memoir, The Stirrings, a memoir in Northern Time. So I've introduced the book bag just right. Did you think, you've been involved in the book world as long as I have? Probably not longer than I have, but did you think now's the time? I'm going to tell my story.
It wasn't. Yeah, I mean, I have worked in almost every aspect of the UK book industry over the last 30 years, but I don't think it was necessarily a case that I thought, oh, I've got a book and this is the next thing I want to do in my career. It was really that I had this idea, or this kind of very compulsive idea about writing about some of the things that happened in my past. And then the opportunity sort of arose during lockdown. I know that a lot of people lost their creativity. A lot of writers just really found it very hard to work under those circumstances. But actually, it seemed to be a bit of a spark for me to be able to write the dread term personal essay, which always seems to be applied to women writing. And I just started to, I wrote an essay for Granta called Bleak Midwinter, which was about what it was like growing up under the shadow, as it were, of the hunt for the serial killer known as the Yorkshire Ripper. And that formed part of the proposal that I sent to my agent, who then got me a book deal, which is nearly 3 years ago now. So that's really kind of how it began. I didn't really have any other work at the time, and I needed to do something, and I was so isolated that it just really came out of that.
I think one of the problems with that, and one of the problems with lockdown and isolation, certainly something that I felt that it could almost be a bit dangerous to stir things up too much. You have to think about your own mental equilibrium, and a lot of the book, resonated very much with me, and I just wondered, were there any times when you just thought, I'm stirring stuff up here, this is actually quite uncomfortable? It's very personal, this book.
Yeah, it is. I mean, the original draft was about 20,000 words longer, so there was a lot that I cut out, and there was a lot that I thought about or even kind of researched in that way that one immerses oneself back in the kind of culture of the past that I didn't actually put in, but it was all very necessary for me to write the book and to get into that vibe again, if you will, of that time, and also connecting with those emotions and trying to dissect that experience, as well as really write about it as if it just happened, because I really wanted to write an impressionistic book rather than one that is kind of omniscient, looking back and looking back really from the past, saying, oh, the XYZ, because I just wanted to write it how it felt to me. Yes, it was difficult to, as you say, stir things up. It was very challenging, very intense, but also I think one should never really write anything that one isn't prepared to talk about or to have other people read. So I had to make that decision, and I did, and there were times when I was writing it and I thought, well, it's not been published yet, let's go see it. And then, of course, when I got to the stage, because only me and my editor saw it for a couple of years, when I got to the stage of it going into the production schedule, I had to kind of let it go, because so many people, by stages, I kind of let it go and become much more separate from me. So yes, it is obviously personal, deeply personal, but it's also a book. And I feel, even it's been out for a couple of months now, I do feel that it's a more separate thing, especially as I'm doing events and talking about it, and also garnering people's reactions to it.
I suppose the point about a book like this is that you would expect it to resonate. I mean, there's no point to it unless there are people out there going, that's what it was like. You know, you've nailed it. That was what the atmosphere was like. Have you had a bit of that from readers, and reviews and things?
Yeah, I've had a lot of. That's also the other really peculiar thing about writing a book, because quite selfishly, and I suppose quite self-absorbedly, I was thinking, well, I'm writing this. I'm not really sure who I'm writing it for. I know that obviously through my publisher that they saw that a good opportunity for a very wide readership, not just my generation or my age group, or as you say, people who've experienced or lived through that era. So what's been interesting to me is there's been such a wide range of responses. I was up at Edinburgh Book Festival about a couple of weeks after it came out, and I did an event with Damien Barr, who's just a brilliant person to do an event with, because he's just so generous and engaging. And of course, we were talking about 10 years of his own memoir, Maggie and Me. And people who came out afterwards to me said, I lived in Yorkshire at the time, or I lived in another part of the UK, but I remember how frightening that whole episode was, especially for women. And then there are younger people, younger women, who really, I think, resonated with some of the other themes in the book, resonated with them. So that to me was really interesting, because for me, being able to have a book that's kind of applicable across a wide spectrum of readership is really, really important. And I didn't just want it to be a kind of, oh, it's all tough in North, which of course, that can be a kind of pigeonholing that happens with books about the North and by Northern writers, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Sort of, ferrets in the bath or whatever.
I'm happy to say I've never seen a ferret.
Me neither. Me neither. I mean, I had, when I worked at Time Out, there was a guy who used to come and sing just past my desk and sing Ilkley Moor at me. And he'd get to the end.
Wrong part of the country. But that's the thing. I think the other thing is about writing about Sheffield as well, is because Sheffield's very well known for its music scene, but not so much for its writers and its literature. And there is this massive tendency to lump everything north of Watford Gap as the North and one homogenous place, when of course, absolutely completely different, all our big cities and our towns. And in fact, in South Yorkshire, where I'm from, Barnsley, Rotherham, Doncaster are very different to Sheffield. So I didn't want to kind of buy into that old myth, of the North, really. But there are sort of, I suppose, some inescapable truths about it, and certainly during the period that I'm writing about.
So what is Northern Time? It's a memoir in Northern Time. I mean, I agree with you. Time moves very differently up there, but tell me what you meant by that.
Well, first of all, my editor asked me to provide a subtitle, and we went through quite a few irritating iterations, such as girl this and girl that, which I really didn't want. So I kind of felt it was as ambiguous in a way as the actual main title. I wanted it to be something that was very much signposting to the North, but also something that was quite ambiguous and sort of something that people could perhaps puzzle out for themselves, because I'm not entirely sure what Northern Time is, but it was that time and it was of the North. So, I think that it is really a coming of age memoir. So I think I suppose there are so many of those that it wanted to be really specific about where and how and why.
Yeah, it's sort of in layers as well, isn't it? I suppose all memoirs are, in a way, because you're looking back at a time with a different perspective, an older perspective, and in looking back, you're aware of patterns. And I think this is a book about patterns and threads and themes that run through that. really is what makes it so gripping. You've said that you cut quite a lot out. Was the structure just always there, or did you move things around? Did you know where you were going to begin and where you were going to end?
Yeah, I struggled a lot before I came to write the proposal with, as I said, I had the idea for a long time. I tried to write this book in a number of different ways over a few years. And then I really struggled with the format. And then during lockdown, again, I was overdue an essay for an anthology called Trauma, Art and Mental Health, which is published by a very small press called Dodo. And I wrote about the lockdown because I was separated from my partner for 3 months and everybody that I knew. And it reminded me very much of the before and after of my parents splitting up, which, my father in my life and then my father just completely out of my life forever. And so I wrote this essay with kind of reference to lots of other kind of artistic and cultural periods and when this kind of before and after time happened, and also my love of 70s disaster movies. And and I realized that I'd sort of stumbled on how I wanted to write the book. So it was originally going to be essays, but then I think really it had to be something that was very linked. So it's really, the chapters are to me meant to be sort of discrete and complete in themselves, but also very linked to what comes next. And they're not necessarily, and then this happened and then that happened. It's not as linear as some memoir is. But I think that's kind of the luxury of writing a memoir, because you absolutely have to pick and choose. And there's a lot that I left out that happened in those years, either good or bad, either because it didn't propel the story along, there could have been too much of X and not enough of Y, or because there were stories that didn't belong to me. They weren't my story to tell, even though they affected me or touched on, my life.
Did you work from diaries or anything like that? Or did you, Ian Wilson used a great phrase, letting down the bucket in the well. What material were you working from? And did you have to kind of cross-check and verify?
Oh, right. Well, no, I didn't actually keep diaries very much. I remember one in sixth form where I wrote, "I missed English today because the weather depressed me," which really just sums up my teenage view.
You're a bit gothy, it has to be said. You're a bit
very much. Well, I was much more gothy then because I had all those pretentious attributes that teenagers have. I'm not even sure if they're attributes. But I didn't have any diaries. What I did have, I think, was very helpful, because growing up in the analog era and going to university before the digital age meant that I had a time capsule of letters and cards and, cinema and gig stubs. And wow. I even had my wall planner for Michaelmas term 1990. So I kept everything, and photographs, of course, because we just used to get them developed at the end of every term. We didn't have mobile phones or anything like that. So I did have all of that. And I immersed myself very much in rereading the books that I'd read in childhood, some of which stood up to the test of time and some of which didn't. Watching loads of series that I'd watched as a kid, like Flambars, which I was obsessed with. I even had the soundtrack album. And we had a litter of kittens that I named after all the characters in the book, even the flying machine. But I didn't put that in my memoir because it was too much. But and also I watched a lot of the films, and of course I listened to a lot of the music. So I really was kind of living, if you like, a parallel life while writing the book, because I was somewhere else a lot of the time in my head. And of course, in terms of the cross-checking, that's with the factual stuff. So I use Sheffield Archives a lot. A lot of the Sheffield history backup came from Sheffield Archives online, and I rebought and books that I'd read, like Over Our Dead Bodies, Women Against the Bomb, or the issues, Digging Deeper, Issues in the Miners' Strike. I do have a kind of short bibliography at the end of the book. Those books that really helped me or shaped the writing of the stirrings. So there was a lot of that, but it wasn't that kind of intense research that that I couldn't anyway go into a library. But there wasn't any of that. So I was actually quite limited. But I was looking at Hansard to remind myself of what had been said in the House of Commons on a particular day. And, I think that's the beauty of the internet, that there's so much you can check now without actually having to leave your home.
What about siblings?
Oh, I don't have any. I'm kidding.
Maybe you had to pretend you didn't have any while you were writing it.
Well, they are obviously there, but I don't think anybody asks a family member to write a memoir. And two of my siblings have read the book, and they really have been very supportive, and they liked it. One of them hasn't, and that's their choice. So, I mean, I don't know if they have, but that's their choice, because, I am writing particularly about our parents' divorce, which is a really painful part of our history as siblings. And although we're four, we're very different. There's big gaps. I'm right at the end. We're very different personalities, and we've had very different lives, and we didn't all live together under the same roof, particularly at any one time. But we still have that family structure, which of course kind of imploded when my parents split up. So I think that is difficult for a sibling to read about. My sister said to me that she really didn't realize until she read the book, she's the oldest, how different our lives were growing up. So she didn't live at home, after I was about 3. So we didn't really ever live together, but she's always been a very strong, almost like a second mother to me, actually. And I think there's a bit in the book where one of her friends, her student friends, thinks that I'm her child, and I'm very confused because I say, am I?
You're very good on the music scene, and it feels very much bliss it was in that dawn to be alive, to be around Sheffield. I mean, at one point you talk about Phil Oakey living in a house. I mean, you always get the impression that people would walk past longing for Phil Oakey to appear at the windows.
Phil Oakey was a customer at my mum's bookshop, and he was an account customer. He was he was a very big, avid book reader, and so I would work there on Saturdays as a teenager, and I would be sort of desperately craning for a a glimpse of Phil and his asymmetric hair.
Yeah.
But I mean, Sheffield is a big city, but it's also quite a small city. So you did run into people, and they were part of the backdrop to our lives. So I think that was all. It wasn't about, celebrity wasn't as it is now. It wasn't something that was so untouchable. I mean, we all used to get smash hits. I can't believe it now. Buy smash hits because you'd be waiting all week to read the lyrics to one particular song. Because that's and that was kind of cultural cachet. And Jackie magazine, which was so influential in my life, especially when they started serializing Judy Blume's Deanie and Forever. Those were very, very important stepping stones in sort of the life of the teenage girl of the early 1980s. And so I think it's all a blend, that magazine culture, which I moved on, I can think my life in magazines, Twinkle for little girls when I was very small, and Ginty and Bunty and all the Beanos, and then Jackie, and then the things that Mum didn't want me to buy, but I did, Photo Love and Mates. Which sounds like a brand of condoms now, but it was actually it was actually a magazine which was slightly more risque than Jackie, which I think tried to be a lot of different things to a lot of different age groups, and then it would sort of move slowly on to what else came next, Just 17 or something like that.
Yeah. I mean, moving to a monthly magazine was such a big step from one of the weeklies. They were a bit more grown up. But I remember we used to, whatever day Jackie was published, we'd all discuss it at break. Morning break was the time to intensively discuss Jackie. And maybe that's when we became literary critics.
Oh, completely. But also, I think the problem pages, which I do allude to, I mean, I had no sex education, really. at school, because I went to this very elitist, posh all-girls school for much of my schooling. And I remember the biology lesson was a video of rabbits reproducing. That's how we were supposed to learn. But my mum was a teacher, so mum had a very no-nonsense approach to that kind of thing. So she had told me very matter of factly what horrific things awaited me as a young woman. But of course, Kathy and Claire kind of went, I think, much deeper than our mothers, because dads never talked about things like that in those days, than our mothers did, and they were kind of answering the questions that we really didn't know how to ask our parents, or we would just, there was most ridiculous myths and rumors that completely get, unfortunately, stuck about sex and all and relationships that you can't, you have to work out.
Yes, there's the old get pregnant from a toilet seat idea, things like that.
You can't get it pregnant standing up, or the first time, or all those things. Yeah, we all believe them, I think.
Well, it's hilarious now. I saw something about, is it Naomi Wolf saying you can menstruate by sitting next to somebody who's had the COVID vaccine or something.
Yes, dear Naomi.
In a way, we were safe. It was all in magazines and bits of paper, Well, there are little details that I'd actually forgotten. And one that made me smile was collecting bottle tops to send off
to the Blue Peter appeal. Silver milk bottle tops. I never knew whether they achieved anything. But we did these things because we were told to at primary school. Yeah. And then you'd see at the end of the year, wouldn't you, this mountain of bottle tops with Val Singleton or whoever, Leslie Judd, in the Blue Peter studio. And I remember another one was knitting squares of to make patchwork for children in Africa. This is vague. What?
Yeah, I think I knitted squares at one stage. I'm not sure if it was for that, but they were all rhomboids. I could never get the tension right.
I was not very good at anything.
They wouldn't have been any good at all for things like that. So yes, tell me about working in the bookshop. I mean, part of the story here, fairly lightly touched on, but on a couple of moments you kind of say, I escaped into the world of books. Books really helped. I, went through the back of the cupboard into Narnia kind of thing in the world of books. So tell me a little bit about that. When did you realise that was a good escape?
Well, I didn't want to write a biblio-memoir because there's so many, and also people have written them so much better than I could, I think. But I was very lucky because I had I learned to read before I went to school, which sounds like some kind of prodigy, but actually I was 5.5 when I went to school because it was different in those days. Yeah. And my mum taught me to read. And so books were a huge part of growing up, both libraries, most of which have been decimated now in Sheffield. And then my mum sort of fulfilled a lifelong dream, really, and left teaching to open a bookshop when I was about 7.
It's all our lifetime dream.
It's amazing. I mean, so she did that, and then, of course, I had even more access to books. She was also I think Mum would have made a great child psychologist because she was very interested. She was a primary school teacher, but was very interested in children's development and education. And she had a really lovely children's section in the bookshop, which was when you came in, it was at the back. And it sounds kind of obvious now because so many bookshops do it, but, it's a very welcoming place where children could access the books, themselves rather than being out of reach and so on. So that was part of that psychological sort of idea behind it. And part of the way that she taught us, I suppose, her own children. And so I guess as well that, the bookshelves at home, Mum and Dad had there was the chimney breast, and then they had their vast bookshelves, which were all full of very different things, very different books, but there was nothing that was censored. So either there or at the bookshop, I sort of got very kind of confused experience of reading. And of course, my brothers, so my sister, as I said, left home when I was very young, but my brothers basically had very different adolescent reading experiences, and I would browse through. One of my brothers was very much into Orwell and Sartre, and also the Dice Man. You remember the Dice Man?
I remember.
So all
that.
these, it's a really kind of horrific. And the other one was into kind of pulp science fiction with titles like Slave Girl of Gore, which was basically sex. And I don't think either of my brothers realized that I was pilfering their bookshelves when they were out and reading all these things that I wasn't supposed to read. So I did have a kind of very much a sort of intellectual introduction to books through the bookshop in terms of the Virago Modern Classics were coming out. That's where I really became engaged with a lot of and women's press, feminist writing, I suppose, and also the kind of pulpy stuff that all teenagers read. We all passed around the copy of Lace, that fell open on that page number. So and Flowers in the Attic. So it was a real mix of things, it's from the kind of highbrow to the kind of lowbrows of the mid. So there was a lot competing. And I was still, I think, as an early teenager, very much stuck in that time slip world. You talk about the escape. It is absolutely true that as a very introverted and shy child, I did escape into books, and I was always, and realise now, very drawn to books where the outcome was always very different to the reality, so that you could change time, like Tom's Midnight Garden or something like that, or you could try and change time so that things would revert to the happy past. Now, of course, life isn't like that, but books can give you some feeling of magic and possibility and power. I think that's why I think a lot of introverted children become writers, because just as a lot of introverted people become actors, it's a way of kind of centering yourself in your own life, but also creating something and creating a kind of persona. Because even though this book is about me, that's a persona as well, which is outside what people necessarily perceive you to be.
You mentioned one book, I think it's Alison Utley, which is, what's that?
It's Traveller in Time.
Traveller in Time, that's it. Well, they've, funnily enough, it's one of those sort of weird moments of synchronicity. I've just been sent a new edition of that. There's a new hardback edition. And I never read that. I read one of hers called A Country Child, or The Country Child. That's
one of my other favourites. That's also set in Derbyshire, where she was from. Yeah, The Country Child is about the seasons. Turn of the 20th century, so early 20th century.
I used to love reading the Christmas,
the wassails,
Christmas reading.
It's wonderful.
So great.
So who's published this hardback?
I don't know. It's somewhere here. I actually
published a hardback edition when I was at the Folio Society. Basically, I was very lucky when I was at the Folio Society, because I published all my favourite children's books.
Did you do Green Gauge Summer by any chance?
Yes.
Because I remember that.
I think that had been done before I joined.
Okay.
And that's another touchstone in the book. The Traveller in Time is very important because it's set in Derbyshire, and it's a place that's very familiar to me, obviously, and the real sort of life manor house that was a place that was known to Alison Utley, very well known, and it's a time slip novel that really, really can be read by adults as well. So that was one of the things that really stood up to the test of time. So it's so beautifully written, and it's about a kind of the usual ill child. There's always an ill child. Goes off to recuperate at country, cousins from in Derbyshire, from her place in London. I think it was published in 1939, and I think it was set actually earlier than that, so about 20 years earlier than that. And she's called Penelope, and their second sight, as they call it, in the family. And she opens the door one day and sees some people in Elizabethan costume playing chess, and it's about time existing, parallel time existing alongside one's own time. And it's a very heightened time of that history in the Elizabethan world, because the people in the drawing room that she sees are the Babingtons, and the Babington plot was the plot to remove Elizabeth I from the throne and replace her with Mary Queen of Scots, who was famously kept not only in Sheffield Castle but in Wingfield Manor in Derbyshire. So that is just an extraordinary historical story based, but it's also a magical book.
I always liked Alan Garner because he wrote about places like Manchester and Cheshire, and it's so incredible when you're a kid to realise that things can be written about the place where you live. And I think that's maybe something that as Northerners you find very special, because there are so many things that are sort of, it's set in Kensington.
Yes, exactly. Or absolutely. Is it Elidor, where they walk into a church in Manchester? And another book that I love was Jill, not set in the north, but set in bombed out London, called Fireweed, Jill Peyton Walsh. But it was about it was about children in bombed out London, and I was fascinated by all of those kind of books. And I did mention a local writer who's still writing, called Linda Hoy, who wrote the book about
the Damned, or is that a different one?
The Damned, yes, The Damned, which is about a CND movement in Sheffield, and it was published when contemporaneous to all of that time. And she also wrote another amazing book called Your Friend Rebecca. So she was very good about writing what we now probably call our young adult books, but in our day there were books for older readers. And so that Z for Zachariah, that was another amazing book because it had a woman triumphant in it. Robert C. O'Brien's novel about nuclear disaster. So there were other changes. I wrote a lot about some, and I just left others out, but they were all so important to me.
You
along with Millie Molly Mandy.
Oh gosh.
Yes. Yeah, that was when I was much younger.
I remember, there was a bit of controversy over, I think it was Pippi Longstocking, because she encouraged you to sort of jump off roofs and things. It was sort of seen as don't do that, kids.
Well, the ones I really hated were the American ones, especially what Katie did, because of course it's my name, Catherine. And those kind of very moralizing tales that were very much a part of American Victorian and early 20th Edwardian literature. And I had all of those, and they were just, but I did love Anna Green Gables and Emily of New Moon. So I loved all those books. I also loved pioneering stories. So my family is originally on my mum's side from New Zealand. And so I loved things like Children on the Oregon Trail, The Children's Crusade, children going through a really shit time.
Always great.
And also kind of triumphing. There's this amazing book called Avalanche, which is, I think, an Austrian or German writer that I love, about a family caught up in an avalanche. I just love this kind of disaster.
Well, even the Wolves of Willoughby Chase, the girls in that are very, very badly treated, and there's as is Sarah Crewe in A Little Princess.
Another book that I still love, that book.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, we published it at the Folio Society, and the cover design looked like Bride of Chucky. So it's slightly ruined that children's classic for me, but there we are.
Oh yes. Well, I mean, talking about your work at the Folio, you obviously commissioned writers there and commissioned illustrators. So you've worked in the actual making of books, and you've worked in journalism. What was there in writing your own book? Was there anything that surprised you, or thought, I really didn't know it would be like that?
I've always been, I hate to say this because I'm like you, I've written critical reviews for a long, long time, and in fact you gave me my first break, Suzi, at the Independent on Sunday. But I was always a bit, it's so callous, slightly dismissive of the writing process and of how people found it really torturous. I'm not to say that I thought it would be easy, but I didn't realize how much it would sort of take over, and also how there isn't really anything else like it. I was very keen, obviously, particularly because I had a contract and publication date to finish my book. Well, when I finished it, I didn't expect to feel as bereft as I felt, because it had so absorbed me for 2 years. And I would say that it's strange. It was very hard, but the most enjoyable part, and I'm saying this really carefully because I'm not sure writing is ever enjoyable, but the best part of the book was actually writing it, even though it was a lot of blood, sweat and tears to do so. Everything else that comes after that seems a little bit easier.
Yeah. So what was editing like? Like you said, you cut a few, few chunks out. Was that pretty? Did you put on another hat for that? Was that when you kind of put on your editing hat, which was different from your creative hat?
Well, I actually edited myself all the way as I was writing, so I didn't kind of get to a manuscript and sort of. I was editing as I went along, but I also had a very good editor, my publisher, Lettuce, Franklin, and she. It was she who basically suggested loads and loads of changes and cuts, which at first I was kind of horrified because I delivered this masterpiece, as I thought. And she's like, "Thank you for this first draft." And I was kind of, isn't the book finished then? And so, I spent another nearly a year, 9 months revising that. And so that's where a lot of the cuts in. But I think you work in a kind of negotiating way with your editor. And again, as it gets to kind of legal and copy edit and proofread, because what's very important to the story. And that there are some things that you just can't leave out. And you really have to kind of accept that there are some things that will have to be cut. Like there was a lot more Sheffield history.
Right.
That there was, but my editor felt that people could, look things up if they need to, and or there was a lot more instances of really unpleasant behavior from men. But then I didn't really want to just write again and again and again about things that I kind of, unfortunately, we understand as part of our lives. I think, a few instances just sort of sufficed. And I didn't want people to kind of feel, because there's a lot in the book that's quite, is quite challenging and quite sad. But I didn't want I wanted people to be entertained by it as well. So I think it was creating that balance and also pushing the narrative forward all the time. So the book is actually not very long. It could have been longer. One review said it could have been longer. And I was like, yes, I knew I should have left those 20,000 words in. But I'm
send
happy.
it to the editor with, highlighter pen.
Well, I'm really happy with the way it's turned out, actually. And I think it's weird now because I, of course, never want to look at it again. And of course, I had to because I recorded the audiobook. So that that was an interesting experience. So that was kind of 2 days in a studio with a producer who was this very calm younger man. I say younger man, probably wasn't that young. But so I would be reading, and I think publishers also like memoirists to record their own audiobooks if possible, because there's quite a lot of authenticity around that. And so I'd be reading and he'd be, okay, can we just take it back to after man-hating, please? And just completely unemotional about it, which kind of helped me to read some of the very difficult passages, because he was just trying to get it right technically. He wasn't at all invested in what I was reading. And I think if I, that really actually helped me to read it. But it also helped me to spot loads of mistakes, which was after the book had gone to final press. That was great. Apparently that's always happens. And so my reading would be punctuated with no.
The funniest example of that was a launch that I went to with Jonathan Franzen. I didn't go with him. It was his launch.
I was going to say, tell us.
My pal. And he was having a nightmare, actually, because there was a tube strike, so half the people didn't get there. Or as he called it, a tube strike. It was in the Serpentine Gallery, and it was the one where somebody came in and snatched the glasses off his face.
I think I was there.
Do you remember that? You remember? If you were there, you might remember this. That, it was already like looking a bit weird, and he got up to read, and he started reading, and then he went, "Hang on, I thought we changed that."
Oh my God, his poor editor.
So
did he move publishers after that?
Oh, I can't remember who the publishers were. And then after, then somebody came in, and he is practically blind without those specs. Somebody assaulted him, basically,
poor Jonathan,
and ran into the park. And then we had armed police because it's the Royal Park and all that kind of thing. And then I was talking to him afterwards, and this is when he went, "You forgot the tube strike." When I was saying, we're not always like this in London. I'm terribly sorry, Jonathan.
But it makes me think about how difficult it is for writers, because, I used to be deputy director of English Pen, and I was at the Pen Pinter Prize last night. And when I was managing that prize, Salman Rushdie won it. It was 9 years ago. And of course, there was always extra security around him, whether, he felt it was necessary or not. But then the awful thing that happened last year. So you just think it's a really tricky thing, isn't it, being in public and being a sort of public figure.
Yeah, well, you've chaired events, haven't you? And I've chaired a lot of events. And one of the things that I thought about the Salman Rushdie thing is that you'd immediately think, well, what would I do? Would you try and tackle the person? Or
well, the guy did. The moderator did. It was amazing, and also got injured.
Hero. Yeah. You kind of hope that you do the same thing if you were in that.
I think I'd probably just run away. But one always hopes to be a hero.
You might be frozen. Yeah. You never know. And just recently, somebody tipped glitter over Keir Starmer, and again, it's like the glasses. It's somebody getting that close.
I think he handled it very well, and they've turned it into a kind of positive for Labour. But it's really scary that security just weren't there in that second. I think we forget, however much we approve of or disapprove of our leaders, so to speak, that they are really very vulnerable. So again, I was just thinking about that.
This. Oh, sorry, go on.
Well, I was just thinking about vulnerability in writing, actually, because I'm a very private person. I know that sounds really bizarre, but a lot of people say, "Why did you write this?" Well, I suppose I'd say it's because I don't think I'd have written something that happened to me last year. And I certainly couldn't have written anything while my parents were still alive.
I wondered about that.
Well, it's obviously better to do things when mum and dad aren't looking in so many cases in life.
Yeah.
But my father would have been really not happy about it. That's putting it mildly. And my mum, I think, would have been, but she would have been sad. I don't think she wanted me to write it, but I think mum would have understood why I wrote it. And I think she'd also been very proud of me for having a book published. So I'm hoping, anyway, it's kind of a tribute to her, the book, in many ways. But yes, it is all about that exposure. I suppose what I tried to do with the book is the only person who's really exposed is me, so that everybody else kind of is composite, that everyone's under a pseudonym or I don't name them. There are instances that you have to kind of move around because legally people can identify themselves, but they can't necessarily be able to be identified by a third party if it's something that's vaguely off color or potentially defamatory. So there was a lot of moving around. So it's interesting that when you're writing nonfiction, how much you in a way kind of have to fictionalize. And I know this through talking to other people who've written memoirs, it's kind of very peculiar what is picked up on that you don't really think about.
Yeah, well, I would just say there are some guys in this book. Some guys, aren't there?
Oh, yes.
So I don't know whether that is an issue and names need to be changed. But, I mean, it's not like you're unkind or... and it's not the sort of memoir where it's an apologia, like I was right all along. It's not that kind of book at all. And it's not, it's not mean or vindictive. It is about a tranche of time and attitudes to women in that tranche of time, which think, well, we've moved on, or have we?
No, I don't think we have. I mean, I think in some ways, of course, I feel that young women have much more agency than I had. I was very naive. And also, there wasn't, the confidence that so many young women to me seem to have, but also there wasn't the kind of endless scrutiny of social media. We just didn't grow up like that. And I'm really grateful that that wasn't how I grew up, because I found it hard enough to grow up as a young woman, as a girl, especially when I became very ill as a teenager and I had this catastrophic sort of body change within a few months, and then back and forth with my weight ballooning and then going down, and had this major operation, which, made a huge difference to my life. But I think that everything that happened to me at school, which, was the standard horrible bullying, ended at the school gate, began and ended at the school gate, because, people just couldn't really, so the most they can do was kind of ring up and put the phone down. I mean, that was it.
Yeah.
It wasn't this. I feel so distressed when I read a report this week about, the kind of mental health, the sort of balance of mental health of girls, young girls and teenagers now, and the happiness index is very low. And that terrible thing, because I think we are encouraged to compare at my old girls' school. I think it's particularly at same-sex schools can get really, really nasty. Any sort of deviation from the norm was just pounced upon, whether it was a physical one, whether it was your family, whether anything at all. And it's so wearing. And I lived with that lack of confidence for so many years. One of the amazing things about writing the book was that I realized that didn't have any power over me anymore.
I remember the wrong shoes, having, just like the heel wasn't quite right, or the colour wasn't quite right. The tiniest detail. Then you'd think, well, clearly I can never wear those shoes again. And your mum would be like, you're wearing those shoes.
Yeah, and you wouldn't be able to explain about how it meant certain ostracism.
Yeah.
And I remember one year the party dresses were supposed to be long or short. I can't remember what I got wrong. Of course, we didn't have much money. So it was literally, oh, well, you'll wear this for a few years. No,
Horror.
Yes, that's not particularly traumatic at all.
No, but I think it is, though. No, I actually, as a teenager, the idea that you've only got one party dress, and every birthday party you're in the same dress, and everybody else has some amazing.
And it is. I had my school duffel coat. I don't think I had another coat. It was those peculiar kind of social signifiers. They can be very, very destructive. Totally.
It is funny to look back at all that, but I loved your description of clothes, when you start getting into sort of teen fashions, and it's sort of velveteen mini dresses and all this kind of thing.
Yeah, my rah-rah skirt when I was 15.
I love all that. I mean, 80s fashions, did you do anything with your hair? I seem to remember that people just had masses of hair.
Well, I always had lots of hair anyway.
Or crazy. You do mention crazy colour.
Crazy colour and henna.
That was a big thing.
Henna and crazy colour. Well, I sort of was trying to get the ends purple, and my headmistress, God rest her soul, not. I was a particular target, anyone who I literally went to school where they measured your skirts, and all the rest of it. Of course, by the time we were 13, 14, 15, we were trying to customize everything we could. And so I would sort of crazy color the ends of my hair purple. I thought this was really kind of revolutionary thing to do. And then I moved, I think I had a henna, and then I would try and dye my clothes in the washing machine and end up dyeing everything else.
That never works, does it?
Well, they never went black. So I spent a couple of years just wearing these abject grey clothes.
Yes.
The dye didn't work.
It's sort of ashy grey, isn't it?
Yeah, and it really, really, it was the early 80s, so it really fitted the mood. Monochrome life up in the north.
Just to get off sort of girls and fashion and all that kind of thing, there is politics, There's some history in the book. I mean, there's not too much of anything, it seems to me. I mean, I suppose you could have made it that sort of dour northern, it's grim kind of thing. You could have written an entire book about the health issues. Some people do. I'm kind of glad that you didn't. These are strands, aren't they? So there's things like, Greenham Common and the miners' strike, which, both of which seem to have loomed large, as large as the Ripper in a way.
Yes, very much so. I mean, I think with miners' strike, obviously the NUM headquarters were based in Sheffield, and it was a big deal for Yorkshire because the percentage of, the ballot that wasn't offered, and then the miners were ordered out on strike. And so it was really in South Yorkshire that, along with other areas of the country, that the miners were really suffering. And my mum helped out with Women Against Pit Closures, which was really important in that it was the first time that women had from those communities and women adjacent to those communities had actually been involved in any kind of active way in the strikes. So in the 1970s strikes, it's very much a sort of masculine area and a masculine ethos. But the thing about, I suppose, the miners' strike, which lasted as long as my bizarrely coincided with my massively changing body when I didn't really know what was going on with me. And I think I wrote, that I had a kind of civil war going on, and the miners' strike was often described as a civil war. And it was only, it was a long, bloody year, the repercussions of which are still being felt in those communities today. And there are many, many unresolved issues, such as the so-called Battle of Orgreave, where there wasn't a single, in the end, prosecution of a miner, but there was a lot of police corruption, which again found itself in the framework of the Hillsborough disaster in 1989. So those are very much things that affected me as somebody from Sheffield. And when I went to university in Cardiff, people just didn't know about these things because I didn't realise a lot of my friends from Cardiff were, well, obviously my Welsh friends did, but a lot of the intake at university from Cardiff was from the home counties. So I realised that then, it wasn't really until I went to university that I realised what a polarised country we lived in and how different it was growing up in the north. And Greenham Common, again, really spoke to, I mean, it's probably not difficult to describe those fears, because I think that fear, it's a different way, the fear of kind of the eco-disaster fear, which also was tied up with the kind of nuclear anxiety. But, I honestly believed that I wasn't going to reach adulthood because there would be a nuclear disaster. And, this was before Chernobyl happened. So when the opportunity came for women to quite accidentally protest the cruise missiles at Greenham, it seemed to be an extraordinary moment of solidarity. And of course it wasn't, because, all movements are divided as each other. But I think it's for me to grasp onto, because I think for me, that was the first time that I really realized that the power of collectivity in terms of how you feel that you can face something that's often quite a faceless, obscure threat, like nuclear terror. And as a teenager, you don't feel that you have any bargaining power because you're not an adult. You can't get a job where you may be able to influence things and make a difference. So that was of interest to me. And the fact that it was women was really important. And then, of course, by this peculiar coincidence, because Sheffield appeared in one of the most frightening films ever made.
Oh, yes. Yeah. So, Threads that people still talk about. Yeah. It's one of the most terrifying things that's ever been.
Yeah, and I was in it as an extra. But that really, I think, having your home city depicted as being annihilated in a nuclear strike, and not just annihilated in a nuclear strike, but the whole aftermath of what nuclear war does, attack does, is something that really still has had a huge effect on me. And so I think wherever we grow up, those are our formative years. But I happened to grow up in a kind of cauldron, I suppose, of unrest, industrial unrest, politics. My mum also was very involved with the local Labour parties. So there were lots of discussions going on in my house as I was growing up, which were pretty much over my head. But that's how I began to learn about local politics and global politics, was really from all that.
It kind of seeps in, I think. You know, it goes over your head until it kind of starts going into your head, you know.
Yeah.
And that's how it works. And I had in fact forgotten that the Yorkshire Ripper was caught in Sheffield.
Behind my school.
Incredibly close. I mean, the brush of the wing of darkness, you know, on your back kind of thing is
I think the thing about because I mean, I do say in the book, we'd been waiting for him to come because he'd been everywhere else. And, you know, and sure enough, there he was. Yeah. But it was extraordinary because, of course, there were so many opportunities to catch him that were just, it was the most blundersome case. And 26 children lost their mothers at the hands of Sutcliffe. I mean, I think that's, for me, that is the most horrific thing. But yeah, that was a really, I wouldn't like to say kind of an I told you so moment, because the way I start my book is I have a prologue where, set in the general cemetery, just before, in fact, he'd just killed who turned out to be his last victim in Leeds.
So he was a bogeyman. I mean, that's
he was a bogeyman, but he was also presented as a bogeyman. You know, it's like, that's why he was called the Ripper. I think the media invented that name because, of course, what we didn't know until the trial was that the crimes were so horrific that they emulated the murders of women, some of whom were working as prostitutes in the East End of London in the 1888. So, but you could imagine. And I think it played a lot on imagination. And of course, you'll remember the hoax tape that just played all the time, everywhere, on buses and shopping centres. You
are no nearer catching me now. I mean, I just remember that.
I got his voice because I had to quote from it in my audiobook. Wow. Apologies, everybody, for my accent, but I had to play it again, and it scared me just as much. And even though it wasn't, we've never heard Sutcliffe's voice, of course. We never heard it, thankfully. But yeah, so it was. And also I think the thing is as well that he could easily have got off, bizarrely, you know, or had a lesser charge and all the rest of it. Because even at the trial, it was all about, oh yes, innocent women and women who really just deserve to be killed. And that has always stayed with me, that absolutely deep-seated misogyny. So yeah, but it wasn't all darkness. There was a lot of fun.
Well, there was a lot of great music, and there was a lot
clubbing.
Of, you know, there's lots of clubbing. Yes,
there's lots of about friendship and sex. Yeah. Well, not too much sex because my sister had to read the book. But I'm glad there was. It is about awakening in all kinds of ways, politically. Yeah,
you know, as a young woman, and the sex does come into it, and the boyfriend, and the music, and the. You know, just the sort of opening up of life is very much part of it. I mean, in that sense, it's anti-Ripper, you know. It's
very euphoric in that way. That's what I wanted, because I, you know, have that down, up. And, you know, I felt that I really tried to remember what it was like to feel all those things for the first time. And I think that's very important, because another reason why I wanted to write the book was I wanted to write things before I forgot them, especially about my father, because I just don't remember very much about him. So there weren't any new memories, I'm afraid, created writing about Dad. But it was important for me to put those down, you know. It was very significant for me and also there's so much you realize about yourself writing a book. People have asked me, was it cathartic? And I would say no, because it wasn't something that is ever resolved, some of those things that I write about. But I did have a lot more insight into all sorts of things, and I could also see where I had behaved less than responsibly, but I'm a bit hard on myself, I think, because I have to remember that I was really young then.
Yeah. Well, again, it's that dual perspective thing. So called The Stirrings. Just tell us why The Stirrings is the title.
It's called The Stirrings because I wanted a sort of dual title, one that seemed fairly ambiguous, but also was to do with growing up, becoming, if you like, and also because The Stirrings is an actual historical event that happened in Sheffield in the 1860s. This led to the forming of the Trades Union Congress. So there were lots and lots. Sheffield is a city which has been famous for making edge tools and cutlery since Chaucer's day. It appears in the Reeve's Tale, and the little mesters, kind of famous for workshops of these sorts of self-employed artisans. But obviously with the Industrial Revolution, that's when Sheffield really kind of began to explode in terms of its status on the world stage, and later the stainless steel inventions, for example. So in the 1860s, there were all sorts of individual unions. There was the Scissor Makers Union, and there was this union, that union, all for very specific tools. And there was the Grinders Union, and the Grinders Union strike for better pay and working conditions, because they worked in disgusting conditions. I mean, the average age, I think, of life was under 40 for industrial Sheffielders, and that was most of the population. While all the big factory owners lived in all the posh houses that they built. Anyway, this strike really was very violent and led to murders and so forth, and it was known as the outrages collectively, but also locally in folklore it was called the Stirrings. And so I wanted really to encapsulate some of Sheffield's history of protest. I mean, Sheffield was an early centre for the Chartist movement as well at the same time, and so that's why I called it The Stirrings. And I had the title for years. I was never going to call it anything else.
Right. And again, it's an aspect of history that isn't that well known outside Sheffield itself. So
yeah, and also so about 100 years after The Stirrings, a musical play was written by a local playwright, and called The Stirrings in Sheffield on Saturday night. And when we moved to Sheffield, it had been revived at the newly built Crucible Theatre. And so we had the soundtrack to this while I was growing up. And so again, it was sort of seared into my memory. But I think even people who are younger than me wouldn't necessarily know what The Stirrings are. But definitely there's a lot of people are fascinated by local history. So I just wanted to kind of give it its due, actually.
Give it a little, yes.
Yeah.
Tip of the hat. Yeah.
So I do get people going, is it called Stirrings or Stirring? I mean, at one point I was calling it the Snivellings because I was having such a hard time writing it, but
But at least it's not a cookbook, Nobody took it.
I can't cook very well.
Nobody took it as a cookbook, which is excellent. Okay, well, I'm going to wrap up now. Very interesting discussion.
My T-shirt.
Oh, yes. Oh, I know you've got merch, haven't you? Well, it's
I've got merch. Well, it isn't actually merch, although I'm sure he'll take orders. So I have had lots of amazing reviews for the book in the press, and one of them was in the Mail on Sunday. And my eldest nephew, who appears in the book aged as a baby, is now nearly 40 and is married and lives in the US. And he sent me through the post my Mail on Sunday review. And he also had a T-shirt made up for himself. And he sent me a photo of him wearing it. And I thought, oh my God, I hope you're not wearing that around Philadelphia. But I don't know if he's taking orders. I myself have no idea what to do with it, because I think I can't wear it in bed. That's really creepy. And I certainly can't wear it to an event. So I don't know what to do with it. So it's just there. But I think it's very interesting to have. That's merch, if you like. Yeah.
What a great thing for him to do. That's incredibly funny. It looks like it could go round you twice. It looks absolutely enormous.
Well, I'm not the waif I used to be, sadly. Oh, yeah.
Anyway, very good fun. Good on him.
Thank you. Thank you for reading the book as well and having such a nuanced and interesting approach to it.
Oh yeah, it's completely fascinating. I knew that I would love it. I'm going to ask my 3 questions.
Oh yes, I've got the answers. Yep.
Good. You've prepped. You've done your homework. So, favorite artwork? What would that be?
Well,
it's not that T-shirt, is it?
Certainly not. I wouldn't call that a work of art. It's well, I have to say this came to mind when somebody on Twitter. Oh no, we have to say X, formerly known as Twitter, said, "What artwork best describes your soul?" And I just posted a picture of Titian's "The Flaying of Marsyas," and I would say that.
Great.
So this is kind of linked to my book, because when I was in 6th form, we went to London for the day to see the Genius of Venice exhibition at the Royal Academy, and that's where I first saw Titian's The Flaying of Marsyas. And Marsyas was this satyr who basically who played against the gods and lost and was flayed alive. And it's the most extraordinary painting, because to me it just really shows the whole degradation of the world and of humanity, and kind of that kind of Weltschmerz, where you just see it in this wanton cruelty and you see the face. But I think also, I think it's because Titian is just, the colours, is the most extraordinary artist of fire and gold, and it's a painting that I've only seen twice, in actuality, but it is, I would say it's a favourite, but it's the one that I think continually has most effect on me. I'm sorry it's not happier.
It isn't happy, but I mean the paint handling is extraordinary. Brushwork. Dresden or somewhere like that, there was a big Titian exhibition a few years ago, and that's the time that I saw it. And it's also mentioned in an Iris Murdoch novel. I mean, she gets some kind of philosophical point out of it. I can't remember which one it is, but
read them all, and they all kind of merge into one sometimes.
Yeah, exactly. They're all set in Hampstead with very precious people, but they're all amazing. But yes, there's something about atrocities and the people who help atrocities and the people who
the bystanders. And I think
the bystanders,
we can apply that to. If you look, you've got a figure here that's half human as well, but you can really apply that to the human condition. So I found it quite an existential painting, actually.
Yeah, amazing piece of work and a great choice. Well, you're practically grew up in a bookshop. You're very well read, but is there a big gap in your reading experience? Is there something that you've not got round to reading that you feel bad about?
There's always a gap in our reading experience. I mean, I've never read Catcher in the Rye. You'll be surprised to know. Considering that I've written a book which is about adolescence, and that's a book about adolescence and not fitting in. I've never read it, and I don't know if I ever will, because I feel I'm just past that age to read it. I think it seems to me that it's a book that you read when you're an unconfident, thinking that you're an iconoclastic outsider, and I just think that chance is gone. So that is the book. That's the book that I haven't read.
That's quite,
and it's not even very long.
Yeah, it's not long. I mean, some people have said Proust and some people have said Ulysses, but I think the interesting thing about it is, you can't read it as you were then. The interesting thing is if you read it then and then you reread it, and it's
which I've done with a lot of books. I talked about some of those books in my book, but no, that's one that I feel will remain unread.
The time is gone. It's gone. And finally, I mean, in all of your career, not just this book, is there any really funny or weird feedback on your work that you would like to share with us?
Well, I have to say it's probably the most in my mind because it's just come out, but it's really strange reading reviews of your work and you think, did I really give that impression? Or honestly, I think what I found kind of strange about a couple of the reviews basically said that I was a bit tasteless in sort of conflating the Yorkshire Ripper with my dad, as in I wasn't doing that, and I didn't say that in the book. I say that, my father was replaced by this shadowy figure because these things happen simultaneously almost. I think it's a kind of strange way to read something so literally. Say, no, Dad wasn't the Yorkshire Ripper, okay? He didn't have a beard, didn't look anything like him. My father was not an evil man. But I found it a bit odd. And the other thing I find a bit odd is I've been asked, why don't you live in Sheffield anymore? And I'm doing some events in Sheffield next week. And, I'm quite prepared for that question. But I think it's kind of bizarre as well because, I could never have written this memoir if I still lived in the city that I grew up in. And in fact, I didn't visit Sheffield. Of course, there was the pandemic while I was writing the book. And I went back last October and I'd finished the book. And it was so strange going back, having immersed myself in the past because nobody was, apart from, my sister's still there, and, there's new generations of our family, but everybody in my book had gone, really. And that I found really peculiar. It was kind of quite a schizophrenic experience. So, so people do ask those questions, and you try and give them the answer that you think is most honest, not the answer that they'll want to hear.
Did Sheffield seem sort of different, like the street plan is different or the houses are smaller or anything like that? Or
from when you're tiny. I go back often, so there was a period in my life in the late 90s that I didn't go back for very often because my mum and stepdad moved to Scarborough, so our family was kind of centered there. But my mum died 7 years ago in Sheffield, and so I was going up a lot for the last few years of her life, and I go, I've been going regularly ever since. So I kind of made my peace with that bit. But also the amazing thing is I really wanted to recreate things so the Botanical Gardens, which was so run down and falling apart when I was a teenager, had this massive lottery grant. It's beautiful, absolutely stunning now. So there's a lot of change. I have to say the city centre is suffering like many city centres are. Even in the recession, it was a very thriving place. I remember it was a destination place to shop. And I saw the Sheffield Star was recently saying that the city centre has destination shops like Boots and M&S. And I thought, those are destination shops, right? I mean, who are you trying to kid? I think it's really symptomatic of what is happening with high streets all over the country. But also I think this, I'll go back and my feet know where to go without me thinking about it. And I remember I went back I was going back a few years ago, I went to catch a bus and I didn't realize that the bus stop no longer existed for that bus. So I was standing there for ages, and I found my sister going, I'm trying to catch the 88. And she was like, oh, you have to go there now. But I just automatically gone to where I just used to stand. So
just stood randomly on the pavement.
I will say one thing:
it's for a non-existent bus.
It's become a very foodie place, which of course is hilarious to me because it certainly wasn't like that when I was growing up. So I think it's incredible, and of course it's a big. Two universities, and we moved there because my dad was academic, are big employers and all of that. But Sheffield, of course, has had its own other big protest in the last few years with the Sheffield Street Trees campaign, where the council cut down got a major this major contractor cut down loads of Sheffield street trees, and a lot of people protesting it who were just ordinary middle class protesters went to court, and it became a kind of global thing. And I think that's still a really big thing about our environment and who owns our environment and what control and what say do we have over our landscape. So Sheffield's obviously a big post-industrial city, but that emphasis is on the post-industrial, but it's also growing up as a very green city. It has loads of parks. It's, it's ringed by the Peak District, and it is, a very beautiful place to me.
Well, that's where Sheffielders go, isn't it? To escape and get a bit of green, they will head off to the Peak District.
Yeah, well, you can just walk through 3 parks and you're there. It's so close. And my childhood was very much a childhood spent, as I say in the book, in the Peak District every weekend, and so it's not just that sort of grey houses and the
It's
bidding
not
buildings.
all doom and gloom, it's there's a lot of joy in the book. So thank you ever so much for writing it, and thank you for joining me in the book bag, Catherine. I shall see you soon, I hope.
Thank you, Suzi. That's been really fun. It's been really fun. Thank you.
And thank you everyone for watching. Join me next time. Please like and subscribe if you've enjoyed that. Do it anyway, even if you didn't, but I've had a great time. She's still there cackling in the background. We'll probably go and have a natter now. So thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time in the book bag. Goodbye.